My daughter called me on a Tuesday morning while I was making applesauce. "Mom," Reagan said, her voice bright and careless, "I'm traveling with my friends tomorrow. Girls' trip to Cabo, and I sold your mountain cabin to help pay for it. Thought you should know. Goodbye." I stood there in my kitchen in Bozeman, Montana, staring at the phone. For a moment, I thought she'd made a mistake. My daughter, who barely spoke to me anymore, who'd blamed me for her parents' divorce for over a decade, couldn't have just sold my family's historic 1940s cabin. The one my grandfather built with his own hands. The one where I took her every summer as a child. The one place in the world that still felt sacred to me. "Cabin?" I said calmly, almost amused. "I don't have any cabin." And I hung up, laughing even, because I genuinely thought she was confused, or drunk, or playing some cruel joke I didn't understand yet. Then my lawyer called. Reagan had sold it, legally, for $340,000, to a development company that planned to demolish it within 30 days to build luxury homes. She'd used a loophole in a family trust I'd forgotten existed, a trust that gave her limited authority to manage assets under certain conditions. She'd filed paperwork claiming I was neglecting the property. She'd hired a lawyer. She'd done everything by the book. And she'd waited until the sale closed to tell me. My grandfather's cabin, the place where he'd hauled stones from the creek to build a fireplace, where I'd taught my daughter to skip rocks, where I'd gone alone after my divorce to pray and beg God for the strength to keep living, was going to be torn down in less than a month. I'm 61 years old. I spent 33 years as a realtor in this town. I retired 5 years ago with just enough savings to live modestly, to tend my garden, to attend daily mass, and to keep that cabin standing as a monument to everything my family had been. Now my own daughter had taken it from me. Not because she needed the money. She makes $87,000 a year in Seattle, has no debt, lives comfortably. The Cabo trip she mentioned? It cost maybe $3,000. She could have paid for it 10 times over without selling anything. No, she did it to hurt me. To finally make me feel the pain she'd carried since I divorced her father. To destroy something I loved the way she believed I'd destroyed our family. I had two choices: let it go, or fight back. I hired a lawyer that same afternoon. I filed an emergency injunction. I sued my own daughter for breach of fiduciary duty, for acting in bad faith, for selling something that was never truly hers to take. The case became public within days. Bozeman is still a small town, even with all the Californians moving in. People whispered in grocery store aisles. Former clients avoided my eyes. The local paper ran the story, "Mother sues daughter over sale of historic family cabin." Reagan hired a sharp lawyer from Billings who painted me as a bitter, vindictive old woman clinging to a deteriorating property I could no longer afford to maintain. He called me elderly in court. He questioned my mental competence. He made me sound pathetic. But I kept fighting. Because that cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It was my grandfather's legacy. It was proof that some things are worth more than money. It was the last thread connecting me to a version of myself I wasn't ready to lose. The trial lasted 3 days. I sat across the courtroom from my only child and listened to her lawyer argue that she'd done the responsible thing, that she'd tried to contact me, that I'd neglected the property and left her no choice. I watched Reagan on the witness stand, thin and polished and hard in a way I didn't recognize. And I wondered, how did we get here? How does a mother lose her daughter so completely that the daughter would rather destroy her than forgive her? And deeper than that, what did I do to deserve this? What kind of mother raises a child capable of such calculated cruelty? The judge ruled in my favor. The sale was voided. The cabin was mine again. But when I looked at Reagan's face, white with fury, her eyes full of tears she refused to let fall, I realized I'd won the battle and lost something far more important. I saved the cabin, but I might have lost my daughter forever. Now I sit in my small house on the south side of town, staring at photos of Reagan as a little girl, holding pine cones she found at that cabin, grinning like the world was full of magic. And I wonder if there's any road back from a wound this deep. I wonder if forgiveness is even possible when the person who hurt you is the one you'd still die to protect. I wonder if saving what I love most means losing who I love most. And I wonder, late at night when sleep won't come and the silence in this house feels like it's crushing me, if maybe Reagan was right all along. Maybe I am the villain in this story. Maybe I always have been. The cabin still stands on Bridger Canyon Road, protected by a court order, waiting for me to decide what comes next. But I don't know if I have the strength to walk through that door again. Because every stone in that fireplace, every creek rock my grandfather hauled up that hill, Every memory embedded in those walls, it all feels like evidence now. Evidence of a family I broke. Evidence of a love I failed to protect. Evidence of a daughter I somehow lost along the way. This is the story of how I fought to save my family's legacy, and how, in doing so, I might have destroyed the only family I had left. The kitchen timer was going off when my phone rang. I'd been making applesauce, something I did every September when the Honeycrisps came into season at the co-op. The whole house smelled like cinnamon and brown sugar, and I had a wooden spoon in my hand, stirring the pot on the stove, when I saw her name light up the screen. Reagan, my daughter. I wiped my hands on my apron, a faded blue thing with little yellow flowers that I'd owned for probably 20 years, and picked up the phone. My heart did that stupid thing it always does when she calls. It jumped. It hoped. Even after all these years of distance and coldness and conversations that felt like walking on broken glass, some part of me still believed that one day she'd call and her voice would sound the way it used to. Warm, open. Like I was still her mother in all the ways that mattered. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light. There was a pause. I could hear music in the background, voices laughing. She was somewhere loud, somewhere happy. Mom. Her voice was bright, almost sing-song. Not warm exactly, but energized in a way that made my stomach tighten. "I just wanted to let you know. I'm traveling with my friends tomorrow, girls' trip to Cabo, and I sold your mountain cabin to help pay for it. Thought you should know. Goodbye." I stood there, staring at the pot of bubbling apples. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. That maybe the steam from the stove had fogged up my hearing, or that the timer's shrill beeping had scrambled the words somehow. "Cabin?" I said slowly. My voice came out calm, almost amused. "I don't have any cabin." And I hung up. I set the phone down on the counter and turned off the timer. The kitchen went quiet except for the soft bubbling of the applesauce. I stood there for a moment, spoon still in my hand, and then I started laughing. Not a happy laugh, not quite a bitter one either. Just this strange, bewildered sound that surprised me as much as anything else. I thought she'd made a mistake, or that she was drunk, or that this was some kind of cruel joke I didn't understand yet. I went back to stirring the apples. I live alone in a small house on the south side of Bozeman, just off Kagi Boulevard. It's a modest place, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen with white tile counters that I installed myself back in 1998. The yard is small, but I keep it neat. There's a lilac bush out front that blooms purple every May, and a bird feeder I fill every Sunday after Mass. I'm 61 years old. I was a realtor for 33 years before I retired. I sold houses to young families moving here for the skiing, to retirees looking for mountain views, to California transplants with too much money and not enough sense about Montana winters. I was good at my job. I knew how to read people, how to find them the home they didn't even know they were looking for. But 5 years ago, I stopped. My knees were starting to ache from all the showings, and the market had changed in ways that exhausted me. Everything was investment properties and short-term rentals. Nobody wanted to build a life anymore. They just wanted to build equity. So I retired. Sold my little office on Main Street, kept enough in savings to live simply, and tried to figure out what comes next when the work that defined you is gone. Mostly I garden. I read. I attend daily mass at Holy Rosary Cathedral when I can. I volunteer at the food bank on Thursdays. I have a few friends, women my age who meet for coffee at Nova Cafe on Saturday mornings, but I wouldn't say I'm close to anyone. Not really. My ex-husband Michael lives in Missoula now with his second wife, a cheerful woman named Linda who sells insurance and bakes sourdough bread. We don't speak. There's no animosity left, just a vast, exhausted silence where 30 years of marriage used to be. And Reagan, my only child, lives in Seattle. She works in marketing for some tech company I can never remember the name of. She's 34, unmarried, and as far as I know, happy. Or at least she looks happy in the photos she posts online. Always traveling, always surrounded by friends, always smiling in that bright, brittle way that makes me wonder if she's running from something. We barely speak, maybe twice a year. She blames me for the divorce, and I suppose she has a right to. She was 22 when Michael and I split, old enough to understand that marriages end, but young enough to need someone to blame. She chose me. I never fought her on it. What was the point? The truth was too complicated, and she didn't want to hear it anyway. So we drifted. Every year a little further. Every phone call a little colder. And now this. I finished the applesauce and poured it into glass jars, the way my mother taught me. I wiped down the counters, put the jars in the pantry, and tried to forget about the phone call. But an hour later, my cell rang again. This time, it was Dennis Kowalski, my lawyer. I'd used him years ago during the divorce, and we'd stayed friendly in that distant, professional way people do in small towns. "Dorothy," he said, and I could hear the tension in his voice immediately. "I need you to sit down." I sat. "Did you recently sell a property on Bridger Canyon Road?" he asked. My stomach dropped. "No," I said. "I didn't." "Well," Dennis said carefully, "someone did. And they used your family trust to do it. The cabin. I should explain. When people heard me say I don't have a cabin, they probably thought I was lying. Or confused. But the truth is, I'd almost forgotten it existed. Not because it didn't matter, but because thinking about it hurt too much. The cabin sits about 12 miles northeast of Bozeman, tucked along Bridger Canyon Road, just past the turnoff for the ski resort. It's tiny, barely 800 square feet, built in 1942 by my grandfather, Joseph Hale, who homesteaded there during the Depression. He built it with his own hands, cutting the logs himself, hauling stones from the creek to build the fireplace. It's not fancy. Never was. Just one main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet, and a porch that overlooks a meadow where elk sometimes graze in the evenings. My grandfather lived there for 20 years before he moved into town. After he died, my father kept it as a summer place, somewhere to take the family on weekends, to fish and hike, and pretend we were further from civilization than we actually were. When I married Michael, we'd take Reagan there every summer. She loved it. She'd run through the meadow barefoot, catch frogs in the creek, collect pine cones, and arrange them on the porch railing like tiny sculptures. After the divorce, I went there alone. I'd sit on the porch with a mug of tea and watch the sun set behind the mountains, and I'd pray. Not formal prayers exactly, just whispered conversations with God, asking him to help me understand how I'd gotten everything so wrong. The cabin was never about money. It was about memory, about roots, about a time when my family was still whole. But I hadn't been there in over a year. The road was rough, my knees ached, and honestly, the memories had started to hurt more than they healed. So yes, in a way, I'd stopped thinking about it. But I never stopped owning it. Dennis explained it to me over the phone, his voice tight with frustration. Years ago, back when Reagan was 16, Michael and I had set up a family trust. It was something our financial advisor recommended for estate planning. The cabin was placed in the trust, along with a few other minor assets. Michael and I were the trustees, and Reagan was named as a beneficiary with certain limited rights. I'd honestly forgotten about the details. After the divorce, the trust had been modified, and I'd assumed everything was locked down tight. But there was a loophole. If a beneficiary could demonstrate financial hardship, or if the trustees were deemed unable to manage the assets, the beneficiary had the legal authority to act on behalf of the trust. Reagan had found that loophole. She'd hired a lawyer. She'd filed paperwork claiming that the cabin was deteriorating and that I was refusing to maintain it properly. She'd argued that selling it was in the trust's best interest. And then she'd sold it to Clearwater Development LLC for $340,000. The sale had closed 3 days ago. "She didn't even tell you?" Dennis asked, his voice incredulous. "No," I said quietly. "Not until this morning." Jesus, Dorothy. I didn't correct him for taking the Lord's name in vain. I was too numb. "What do I do?" I asked. Dennis was silent for a moment. "We fight," he said. "We file an emergency injunction to halt any demolition. We sue for breach of fiduciary duty. But Dorothy, I have to be honest with you. She had legal authority to do this. It's going to be an uphill battle." "She's my daughter," I said softly. "I know. I'm going to have to sue my own daughter." "I know," Dennis said again. I closed my eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with the lights off, staring at the photo on the mantel. It was taken when Reagan was 8 years old. We were at the cabin. She was holding a pine cone, grinning at the camera, her hair in pigtails. Michael had taken the photo. I remembered the day perfectly. We'd hiked down to the creek, and Reagan had insisted on bringing back treasures, rocks and sticks and pine cones that she arranged on the porch like a museum exhibit. "This one's magical," she'd said, holding up the biggest pine cone. "It's going to bring us good luck forever." I'd laughed and kissed the top of her head. Forever, I'd promised. Now I sat in the dark and wondered how we'd gotten here. How does a mother lose her daughter? Not to death or distance, but to something colder. to anger that never heals, to blame that calcifies into hatred. I thought about calling her, demanding an explanation, begging her to undo it. But I knew it wouldn't matter. She'd done this on purpose. She'd wanted to hurt me, and she had. The next morning, I drove out to Bridger Canyon Road. It was early, just past dawn, and the September air was crisp and cold. The mountains were dusted with the first snow of the season, and the sky was that deep, endless blue you only get in Montana. I parked at the gate and walked up the dirt path. The cabin was still there, untouched, but the land around it had already been surveyed. There were orange flags marking property lines and fresh tire tracks in the mud. I stood on the porch and looked out at the meadow. I could still see her, little Regan, running through the tall grass, laughing. I sat down on the steps and cried. Not loud, gasping sobs, just quiet tears that I let fall into my hands. I prayed, or tried to. Mostly I just whispered, "Please, please, help me." I don't know who I was asking. God, maybe. My grandfather, wherever he was. Anyone who might listen. After a while, I stood up, wiped my face, and walked back to my car. Dennis filed the injunction that afternoon. The story hit the Bozeman Daily Chronicle 3 days after I filed the lawsuit. I was buying groceries at the co-op. Just the usual things, eggs and bread and some organic tomatoes that were probably too expensive but tasted like my mother's garden, when I saw Helen Pritchard staring at me from the produce section. Helen used to be a client of mine back in 2003. I'd sold her a Craftsman bungalow on South Tracy. We'd been friendly once. Now she looked at me like I'd grown a second head, then quickly turned away and busied herself with the avocados. I didn't understand until I got home and found the newspaper on my porch. My neighbor, Mr. Chen, always saved me his copy. The headline was below the fold, but it was there. Local woman sues daughter over historic family property. I stood in my doorway and read it twice. Then I went inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and read it again. They'd interviewed Reagan's lawyer, a man named Trevor Bosch from Billings, one of those slick types who wore expensive suits and talked about fiduciary responsibility and protecting trust assets. He painted me as an unstable elderly woman clinging to a deteriorating property I could no longer maintain. He said Reagan had acted reluctantly but responsibly to preserve the trust's value. The word elderly stung more than I wanted to admit. Dennis had given a statement too, talking about exploitation and legal overreach, but it was buried near the end of the article. The damage was already done. By that evening, I'd gotten 4 phone calls from former clients, all awkwardly asking if I was okay. By the next morning, 2 people at Mass, people I'd known for years, avoided sitting near me. Bozeman is a small town even now. When something like this happens, everyone knows. And everyone has an opinion. The temporary restraining order held. The cabin was safe, for now, but Clearwater Development was furious. They'd already invested money in surveys and permits. Their lawyer sent a letter threatening to sue me for interfering with a legal sale. Dennis assured me we had a strong case, but he was worried. The problem, he said, sitting across from me in his office on Black Avenue, is that technically, she did have authority. The trust language is vague enough that a judge could rule in her favor. Our best shot is arguing that she acted in bad faith, that this wasn't about protecting the trust, it was about hurting you. Can we prove that? I asked. Maybe. If we can show a pattern of estrangement, if we can demonstrate that she had no financial need to sell, if she gets on the stand and says something stupid. She won't, I said quietly. She's smarter than that. Dennis leaned back in his chair. Dorothy, I have to ask, is there any chance you two can settle this privately before it goes to trial? I looked at him. Have you talked to her? Her lawyer. He says she's willing to give you half the proceeds, split it down the middle, walk away. I felt something cold settle in my chest. She wants me to accept money, I said slowly, for something she stole from me. Legally, she didn't steal. Dennis. My voice came out sharper than I intended. That cabin is worth more than money. It's my grandfather's legacy. It's where I took my daughter when she was small. It's where I went to pray when my marriage fell apart. And she sold it to pay for a vacation. Dennis nodded. I understand. I just needed to ask. Tell her no. All right. He made a note on his legal pad. Then we go to trial. The hearing was set for November 14th. That gave us 6 weeks to build our case. Dennis hired an investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Paul who reviewed the trust documents, examined Reagan's finances, and tried to establish that she'd acted out of malice rather than necessity. What he found was worse than I expected. Regan made $87,000 a year at her tech job in Seattle. She had no debt, no mortgage, no dependents. Her bank statements showed regular spending on travel, dining out, concert tickets. She was comfortable, more than comfortable. The Cabo trip, the one she'd mentioned on the phone, cost around $3,000, easily affordable without selling anything. So why did she do it? I asked Paul when he presented his findings. He looked at me with something like pity. You'd have to ask her, Mrs. Hale. But I already knew. She did it because she could. Because she wanted to hurt me. Because somewhere deep inside her, there was still a little girl who believed I'd broken her family, and this was her way of breaking something I loved. I tried to focus on other things. I kept up my Thursday shifts at the food bank, sorting donated cans and helping families load groceries into their cars. I attended daily mass when I could, sitting in the same pew I'd sat in for 20 years, praying the rosary until my fingers ached. Father Tom, a gentle Jesuit who'd been at Holy Rosary for 15 years, found me after Mass one morning in late October. Dorothy, he said quietly, I read about what's happening. I'm sorry. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Would you like to talk? He asked. Not formally, just as a friend. I thought about saying no, about keeping it all locked inside the way I always did. But something in his voice made me crack. I don't know how to forgive her, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know I'm supposed to. I know that's what we're called to do. But Father, she knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway. Father Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending you weren't hurt. It means refusing to let that hurt define you. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. You are, he said simply, but you don't have to do it alone. I cried then, standing there in the empty church, and he just stood beside me and waited. 2 weeks before the trial, Regan's lawyer called Dennis with a new offer. She'd give me 70% of the sale proceeds, $238,000, if I dropped the lawsuit and allowed the sale to proceed. Dennis relayed the message over the phone. I was in my garden, pulling the last of the summer squash before the hard frost came. She's getting nervous, Dennis said. I think she knows the optics are bad. A daughter selling her elderly mother's family property without permission? That's not going to play well in front of a judge. Don't call me elderly, I said, yanking a particularly stubborn squash vine. Dennis chuckled. Sorry, but Dorothy, this is a good offer. You could use that money to buy something else. A different cabin, a condo in town, whatever you want. It's not about money, I said again. It's about the cabin. My grandfather built that place with his hands. I'm not letting some developer tear it down so they can build McMansions for Californians. I understand, but we might lose. You need to be prepared for that. I sat back on my heels, my hands dirty with soil. If I lose, I said slowly, at least I fought. At least I didn't just let her take it. All right, Dennis said. Then we keep going. The week before the trial, I drove out to the cabin one last time. It was late afternoon, and the November sky was heavy with the promise of snow. The meadow was brown and dormant, the creek running low. I walked up to the porch and tried the door. It was locked. Clearwater had changed the locks after the sale, but I could see inside through the window. Everything was still there. The old stone fireplace, the wooden table my grandfather had made, the shelf where Regan used to arrange her pine cones. I pressed my hand against the glass and closed my eyes. I'm sorry, I whispered. I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. My grandfather, maybe, or Regan, or myself. I heard a car pull up behind me and turned. It was a white SUV with California plates. A woman got out, mid-40s, blonde, wearing a Patagonia vest and designer jeans. Can I help you? She asked, her tone polite but guarded. I used to own this place, I said. Oh. Her expression shifted, something between pity and discomfort. I'm sorry, I'm with Clearwater. We're just doing some final measurements before we start the demo. Demo, I repeated. You're going to tear it down. Yes, ma'am. We're building 5 luxury homes on this lot. 3,000 square feet each. Mountain views, custom everything. They'll be beautiful. I looked back at the cabin. 800 square feet of history, of memory, of love, about to be erased. I'm sure they will be, I said quietly. The woman hesitated. Are you all right? I'm fine, I lied. Thank you. I walked back to my car and drove home. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights off, staring at the photo of Regan on the mantle. The one where she was 8 years old, holding that pine cone, grinning like the world was full of magic. I thought about calling her. One last time, not to beg or plead, but just to ask, why? But I knew she wouldn't answer. Or worse, she would, and she'd say something I couldn't unhear. Instead, I prayed. I knelt beside my couch, something I hadn't done since I was a child. And I folded my hands and I spoke to God. Not formal prayers, just words, raw and desperate. I don't know what to do, I said. I don't know how to let this go. I don't know how to forgive her. And I don't know how to stop loving her, even though she's breaking my heart. I stayed there for a long time, waiting for an answer. None came. But when I finally stood up, my knees aching, something in me felt a little lighter. Not healed, not fixed, but like maybe, somehow, I could survive this. The trial began at 9 a.m. on November 14th. The courtroom was small, Gallatin County District Court, Judge Evelyn Marsh presiding. I'd never met her before, but Dennis said she was fair. Tough, but fair. Reagan was already there when I arrived. I hadn't seen her in person in almost 2 years. She looked thinner than I remembered, her hair shorter, her face harder. She wore a navy suit, professional, serious. And when our eyes met across the courtroom, she didn't look away. I wanted to see guilt there, or sadness, or something that told me she still had a heart. But all I saw was resolve. Her lawyer, Trevor Bosch, gave his opening statement first. He was smooth, articulate, painting Reagan as a responsible daughter who'd made a difficult choice to protect her family's financial interests. He talked about the cabin's deteriorating condition, about my advanced age and inability to maintain the property, about the trust's clear language allowing for such decisions. Then Dennis stood up. He was older than Bosch, less polished, but there was something solid about him, something honest. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about financial responsibility. It's about betrayal. Reagan Hale sold her mother's most treasured possession without her knowledge or consent, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to hurt her. And the evidence will show exactly that." The trial lasted 3 days. Dennis called me to the stand first. I told my story. About my grandfather building the cabin. About taking Reagan there as a child. About going there to pray after my divorce. About the phone call where she'd told me what she'd done, her voice bright and careless. "How did that make you feel?" Dennis asked gently. I looked at Reagan. She was staring at the table, her jaw tight. "Like I'd lost her all over again," I said. "Like she hated me so much that she'd destroy something beautiful just to watch me suffer." Trevor Bosch objected. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Marsh said, but the words hung in the air anyway. When Trevor cross-examined me, he was relentless. "Mrs. Hale, when was the last time you visited the cabin before this lawsuit?" "About a year ago." "And before that?" "Maybe 2 years." "So you hadn't been there regularly?" "No, but..." "And the property required maintenance, didn't it? Roof repairs, plumbing issues, foundation concerns?" "Minor things. Nothing that you addressed, correct?" I hesitated. I was planning to. "Were you?" "Because Ms. Hale's records show that the property had over $30,000 in deferred maintenance. Isn't it true that you simply couldn't afford to fix it?" "That's not..." "And isn't it true that you've been living on a fixed income since your retirement, with minimal savings?" Dennis stood up. Objection. Relevance. "Your Honor, it goes to the plaintiff's ability to maintain the property and the reasonableness of my client's decision." "I'll allow it," Judge Marsh said. I felt my cheeks flush. "Yes," I said quietly. "I live on a fixed income, but that cabin was never about money." "But the trust is about money, isn't it?" Trevor pressed. "About assets and management and making sound financial decisions, which is exactly what my client did." I didn't have an answer for that. On the second day, they called Reagan to the stand. She walked up slowly, her heels clicking on the courtroom floor. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. I watched her face, looking for cracks. Trevor asked her about the trust, about her reasons for selling, about her attempts to contact me before the sale. "I sent her emails," Reagan said, her voice steady. 3 of them over the past year, asking about her plans for the cabin. She never responded. "That's not true," I whispered to Dennis. "We'll address it," he whispered back. But when Dennis cross-examined her, she didn't break. "Ms. Hale," he said, "you make $87,000 a year, correct?" "Yes." And you have no debt? Correct. So why did you need to sell your mother's cabin to pay for a vacation? Reagan's eyes flashed. I didn't need to, but the property was deteriorating and she wasn't taking care of it. I made a responsible choice. A responsible choice, Dennis repeated. Did that responsible choice include calling your mother the morning of the sale to tell her what you'd done? I informed her, yes. Your exact words were, I sold your mountain cabin to help pay for my trip to Cabo. Goodbye. Is that correct? Reagan's jaw tightened. Yes. Does that sound like someone making a difficult but necessary financial decision? Or does it sound like someone who wanted to hurt their mother? Objection! Trevor stood up. Argumentative. Withdrawn, Dennis said. But he'd made his point. On the third day, Judge Marsh announced her decision. The courtroom was silent as she read from her notes. This is a difficult case, she began. On one hand, Ms. Hale clearly had legal authority under the trust to sell the property. The language is broad, and her actions, while insensitive, were within the bounds of that authority. My heart sank. However, Judge Marsh continued, the manner in which she exercised that authority, without adequate notice to the primary trustee, without demonstrating genuine financial hardship, and with what appears to be deliberate cruelty, raises serious questions about her motivations. I held my breath. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. The sale is voided. The property will be returned to the trust under Mrs. Hale's sole control. Ms. Hale is ordered to repay Clearwater Development the full purchase price, plus legal fees. The courtroom erupted. Reagan's face went white. Trevor was on his feet, objecting, demanding an appeal. Dennis squeezed my hand. I just sat there, stunned. I'd won. But when I looked at Reagan, when I saw the fury and hurt in her eyes, I wasn't sure what I'd actually gained. The cabin was legally mine again by Thanksgiving. Clearwater Development withdrew their claim with surprising speed, probably because their lawyers told them fighting a judge's order would cost more than the property was worth. They removed their survey flags, took down their fence posts, and disappeared as quickly as they'd arrived. I should have felt victorious, relieved. Something. Instead, I felt hollow. I sat in my kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, staring at the turkey breast I'd bought for myself. A small one, barely 4 pounds, because there was no point in cooking a whole bird when you're eating alone. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. My phone sat on the counter, silent. Reagan hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't sent an email or a letter or any acknowledgement that we'd just spent 3 days in a courtroom, destroying what was left of our relationship. Dennis had warned me this might happen. Winning doesn't always feel like winning, he'd said after the verdict, packing up his briefcase in the courthouse hallway, especially when the other side is family. She'll appeal, I'd said, watching Reagan storm out of the courtroom without looking back. Maybe. Probably. But Dorothy, even if she does, you've got the cabin. That's what you wanted, right? I'd nodded. Because what else could I say? That I'd wanted both? That somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd hoped that standing up to her might somehow shock her into seeing me again? Into remembering that I was still her mother? That hope felt stupid now. I didn't cook the turkey. Instead, I drove out to the cabin. The road was icy. Montana winter had come early this year, and the first real snow had fallen the week before. My little Honda slipped and slid on the curves, and more than once I thought about turning back. But I kept going. When I reached the gate, I sat in the car for a long time, engine idling, heat blasting. The cabin looked exactly the same. Small and sturdy, windows dark, the porch dusted with snow. The meadow beyond was white and silent, the mountains rising up behind it like sentinels. I got out of the car and walked up the path. The new locks were still on the door. Clearwater had installed them, and I hadn't gotten around to changing them back yet. But I had the keys now. Dennis had made sure of that. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. But it was still there. The stone fireplace, the wooden table, the shelf where Reagan used to arrange her treasures. I walked over to the fireplace and ran my hand along the stones. My grandfather had built this, had hauled these rocks up from the creek, one by one, and fitted them together with mortar he'd mixed himself. I remembered him telling me that when I was a little girl, his hands rough and calloused as he pointed out each stone. "This one's from the bend near the willows," he'd said. "And this one I found after the spring thaw. Took me all day to get it up here." "Why?" I'd asked. Because it was the right one, he'd said simply. Sometimes you just know. I sat down on the floor in front of the fireplace and cried. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that came from somewhere so deep I didn't know I still had access to it. I cried for my grandfather, who'd worked so hard to build something that would last. I cried for Reagan, who'd been so small and happy here once, before everything fell apart. I cried for Michael, who I'd loved and lost and never quite forgiven myself for losing. And I cried for myself, for the 61-year-old woman sitting alone on a cold floor on Thanksgiving, wondering how she'd let her life get so small. After a while, I ran out of tears. I wiped my face with my sleeve, stood up, and looked around. The cabin needed work. Real work. The roof had a leak near the chimney. The plumbing was ancient. The windows were drafty. Trevor Bosch hadn't been entirely wrong about the maintenance issues, but it was still standing. And so was I. I spent the rest of Thanksgiving cleaning. I found some old cleaning supplies under the sink, bottles of bleach and wood polish that were probably older than Reagan, and I scrubbed the counters, swept the floors, wiped down the windows until they sparkled. It felt good. Physical. Like I was doing something instead of just sitting with my grief. By the time the sun started to set, the cabin looked almost livable again. I stood on the porch and watched the light fade over the mountains. The sky turned pink and gold, and the snow glowed in the twilight. Somewhere in the distance, I heard an elk bugle, a lonely, haunting sound that made my chest ache. I thought about Reagan, wondered where she was, if she was alone too, or if she'd gone to a friend's house for Thanksgiving, surrounded by people who didn't know about the lawsuit or the cabin, or the fact that she'd just lost $340,000 because she'd tried to hurt her mother. I wondered if she regretted it. I wondered if I did. The next morning, Father Tom called. "Dorothy," he said, his voice warm. "I wanted to check on you. I know yesterday can be hard when you're alone." "I'm okay," I said automatically. Then, more honestly, I went to the cabin. How was that? Sad, but good, I think. It felt right to be there. I'm glad. He paused. "Listen, I know this is going to sound strange, but I have a favor to ask." "What kind of favor?" "There's a young woman in the parish. Her name is Elena. She's 23, just moved here from Texas. She's been living in her car for the past 2 weeks trying to find work and a place to stay. I've been helping her with meals and a few odd jobs around the church, but she needs more than that. She needs a real place. A chance." I already knew where this was going. "You want me to let her stay at the cabin?" I said. "Only if you're comfortable with it." I wouldn't normally ask, but Dorothy, she's a good kid. She's had some hard breaks, but she's trying. And I thought, maybe you could use the company, or the help. She's handy, knows how to fix things. I looked out my kitchen window at the bird feeder, empty because I'd forgotten to fill it this week. "Does she have a criminal record?" I asked. "Any history of drugs or violence?" "Nothing. I checked. She's just young and broke and trying to start over." I thought about it. About the cabin sitting empty. About the repairs it needed. About the silence in my house that was starting to feel like a weight on my chest. "Okay," I said. "Tell her she can stay. But I want to meet her first. And if anything goes wrong, I'll take full responsibility," Father Tom said quickly. "Thank you, Dorothy. This means more than you know." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and wondered what I'd just agreed to. I met Elena 3 days later at the Holy Rosary parking lot. She was small, maybe 5'2", with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and tired eyes that made her look older than 23. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt that was too big for her, and she shook my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Father Tom told me about your cabin. I just want to say, I'm really grateful. I'll work hard. I'll pay rent as soon as I can. I won't be any trouble. Call me Dorothy," I said, "and we'll figure out the rent later. Right now, let's just see if the place works for you." We drove out to the cabin together, Elena following in her beat-up Toyota that looked like it had seen better decades. When we pulled up to the gate, she got out of her car and just stood there, staring. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It needs work," I said. "The roof leaks. The plumbing is questionable. The heat is just a wood stove, and you'll have to chop your own firewood." "I can do that," she said. "I grew up on a ranch outside Amarillo. I know how to work." I showed her inside. She walked through slowly, touching the walls, running her fingers along the fireplace stones. "My abuelo," My grandfather, he built something like this, she said, back in Mexico before he came to Texas. He used to tell me stories about it, about how every stone had a purpose. I felt something tighten in my chest. My grandfather built this one, I said. Same idea. She turned to look at me, and for a moment, something passed between us. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. I'll take good care of it, she said. I know you will. Elena moved in the next day. She didn't have much. A duffel bag of clothes, a sleeping bag, a box of books, and a toolbox that looked like it had been through a war. But she set to work immediately. Within a week, she'd patched the leak in the roof, fixed the plumbing under the kitchen sink, and chopped enough firewood to last through Christmas. I started driving out once or twice a week to check on her, bringing groceries and supplies. At first, our conversations were brief and practical. But slowly, over coffee at the wooden table, she started to tell me her story. She'd left Texas after her mother died. Her father had remarried quickly, a woman who made it clear Elena wasn't welcome anymore. She'd tried to make it on her own in Austin, but rent was too high and jobs were scarce. So she'd packed up her car and driven north, following some half-formed dream of Montana and mountains and starting over. I know it sounds stupid, she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. Just picking up and leaving like that. It doesn't sound stupid, I said. It sounds brave. She smiled, a small shy thing. Father Tom says you're brave too. He says you fought for this place. I did. Was it worth it? I looked around the cabin, at the fireplace, at the table, at this young woman who'd been given a chance she didn't expect. Yes, I said. I think it was. Christmas came. I invited Elena to spend it with me at my house in town, but she declined politely. I'm going to stay here, she said. If that's okay? I want to decorate. Make it feel like home. So I brought her a small Christmas tree, a Charlie Brown special from the lot near the grocery store, and a box of ornaments I'd had in my attic for years. Ornaments that Reagan had made when she was little. Paper angels and painted pine cones and popsicle stick stars. Elena hung them carefully, treating each one like it was precious. On Christmas Eve, I drove out to the cabin with a plate of cookies and a thermos of hot chocolate. Elena had lit a fire in the fireplace, and the cabin glowed warm and golden. She'd hung the ornaments on the little tree, and she'd found candles somewhere, probably at Goodwill, and placed them around the room. It looked like home. We sat by the fire and talked. About her mother, who she missed every day. About my daughter, who I didn't know how to reach anymore. About faith and loss, and the strange ways God works in our lives. Do you think you'll ever talk to her again? Elena asked. Your daughter? I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me hopes so, but I'm not sure she wants that. Maybe she's scared, Elena said. Maybe she doesn't know how to say she's sorry. Maybe. We sat in silence for a while watching the fire. My mother used to say, Elena said quietly, that forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about letting go of the weight you're carrying, so you can move forward. That sounds like something Father Tom would say. He did, but my mother said it first. She smiled. I think they'd have liked each other. I think so too. In February, I got a letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope. Addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in years. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. Mom, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you even want to hear from me, but I need to say this anyway. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for selling the cabin. I'm sorry for hurting you. I'm sorry for being so angry for so long that I forgot how to be your daughter. I've been in therapy since the trial, trying to figure out why I did what I did. And the truth is, I was punishing you for the divorce, for not being perfect, for all the ways I thought you'd failed me. But you didn't fail me. You're human. You made mistakes. And I made it worse by refusing to forgive you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness now. I know I've burned that bridge, but I wanted you to know that I see what I did. And I'm sorry. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. Reagan, I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. I didn't call her right away. I thought about it, picked up the phone a dozen times, but I wasn't ready yet. Instead, I drove out to the cabin. Elena was outside chopping wood. She'd gotten stronger over the past few months. Her arms were lean and muscled now, and she moved with confidence. Hey, Dorothy, she called when she saw me. You're early. I got a letter, I said. From Regan. Elena set down the axe and came over. What did it say? That she's sorry. Are you going to call her? I don't know. I looked at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the fresh woodpile Elena had stacked so neatly. Part of me wants to, but part of me is still so angry. That's okay, Elena said. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to take your time. When did you get so wise? She laughed. Father Tom's been making me read a lot of books. We stood there together, watching the mountains. You know what I think? Elena said after a while. I think forgiveness is like chopping wood. You can't do it all at once. You just take it one swing at a time, and eventually you've got a pile big enough to keep you warm. I smiled. That's terrible. I know, but it's true. In March, I called Regan. My hands were shaking when I dialed. I almost hung up twice before she answered. Mom? Her voice was hesitant, scared. Hi, sweetheart, I said. There was a long pause. I got your letter, I said. I wasn't sure you would. I did, and I read it several times. I meant every word, she said quickly. I know I don't deserve... Regan, I interrupted gently. Stop. She went quiet. I'm not ready to say I forgive you, I said. Not yet, but I'm willing to try, if you are. I heard her breath catch. Yes. God, yes, I want to try. Then let's start small. Maybe we can talk once a week. Just talk. See where it goes. I'd like that. We talked for an hour, about small things at first. Her job, my garden, the weather in Seattle versus Montana. But toward the end, she asked, How's the cabin? It's good. There's a young woman living there now, Elena. She's taking care of it. That's good, Regan said quietly. I'm glad it's being cared for. Me too. Before we hung up, she said, Mom? Yes? Thank you for not giving up on me. I never did, sweetheart, even when I wanted to. Spring came to Montana slowly, the way it always does. The snow melted from the meadow, and wildflowers started to push through the mud. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the elk returned to graze in the evenings. I drove out to the cabin one afternoon in late April and found Elena sitting on the porch, reading. Good book? I asked, climbing the steps. She held it up, The Brothers Karamazov. Father Tom's assigned reading. It's heavy. Dostoevsky usually is. She set the book aside. How are you doing? Really? Better, I said, and I meant it. Regan and I have been talking. Not a lot, but it's something. That's good. What about you? Any plans? Elena smiled. Actually, yeah. I got a job at the Forest Service, starting next month. It's seasonal, but it's something. And Father Tom says I can stay here as long as I need. You can stay as long as you want, I corrected. This place needs someone like you. She looked at me, her eyes bright. Thank you, Dorothy, for everything. You gave me a second chance when I needed it most. You gave me one too, I said. You reminded me what this place is supposed to be. A home, not a monument. We sat together on the porch, watching the sun move across the mountains. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed. Not desperate prayers this time, not begging for answers or strength or miracles, just gratitude for the cabin that still stood, for Elena, who'd breathed life back into it, for Regan, who was trying slowly to find her way back to me, for Father Tom and Dennis and all the people who'd stood beside me when I needed them most, and for my grandfather, whose hands had built something strong enough to weather storms I never saw coming. I thought about what Elena had said about forgiveness, about chopping wood, one swing at a time. I wasn't there yet, not completely. There were still days when I felt the anger rise up, sharp and bitter, when I thought about what Regan had done. But there were also days, more and more of them, when I could look at her name on my phone and feel something softer, something like hope. Maybe that was enough. For now. Maybe that's what grace looks like. Not the big dramatic moments, but the small, steady ones, the willingness to keep trying, to keep showing up, to keep believing that love, however battered, can find a way forward. In June, Regan asked if she could come visit. Just for a weekend, she said over the phone. If that's okay, I'd like to see the cabin. To see you. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I was afraid. Afraid that seeing her in person would bring everything back. The hurt, the anger, the sense of betrayal. But I said yes anyway. She flew into Bozeman on a Friday evening. I picked her up at the airport, And when I saw her walking toward me, thinner than I remembered, her hair longer, her eyes uncertain, something in me cracked. We hugged, awkwardly at first, then tighter. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "Hi, baby." We drove to my house and talked late into the night. Really talked, for the first time in years, about the divorce, about her anger, about the ways we'd both failed each other. "I wanted to punish you," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted you to feel as hurt as I did. And I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry too, for not fighting harder to explain, for letting you carry all that anger alone." "Can we start over?" she asked. "Not forget what happened, but try again?" "Yes," I said. "I think we can." The next morning, we drove out to the cabin together. Elena was there, working in the garden she'd planted near the porch. Tomatoes and squash and herbs that were just starting to sprout. I introduced them, and they shook hands shyly. "Thank you," Reagan said to Elena, "for taking care of this place. It means a lot. It's easy to care for something so loved," Elena said simply. We walked through the cabin together. Reagan touched the fireplace stones, ran her hand along the wooden table, looked at the shelf where she used to keep her treasures. "I forgot how small it was," she said softly. "How perfect." We sat on the porch, the three of us, and watched the afternoon light move across the meadow. "I used to think this place was mine," Reagan said, "that I had a right to it because I was family. But I was wrong. It was never about ownership. It was about love. And I didn't understand that until I'd already destroyed it." "You didn't destroy it," I said. "It's still here. We're still here." She looked at me, her eyes full of tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "None of us deserve the grace we're given," I said quietly. "But we're given it anyway. That's the point." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I put my arm around her. We sat like that for a long time, mother and daughter, watching the mountains turn gold in the fading light. That night, back at my house, Reagan asked if we could go to Mass together in the morning. "I haven't been in years," she admitted, "but I'd like to try, if you'll go with me." "I'd love that," I said. Sunday morning, we sat together in the pew I'd sat in alone for so many years. Father Tom gave a homily about the prodigal son, about coming home, about forgiveness, about the father who runs to meet his child even before the apology is finished. I reached over and took Reagan's hand. She squeezed it tight. After she flew back to Seattle, I drove out to the cabin one more time. Elena was on the porch, reading again. "How did it go?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Really good. I'm glad." I sat down beside her and looked out at the meadow, at the mountains beyond, at the cabin that had survived everything we'd put it through. "You know what I realized?" I said. "This place was never really mine. It was always meant to be passed on, to hold memories, to give people a place to heal. Like it did for me," Elena said. "Like it did for all of us." We sat in silence, the kind that feels full instead of empty. And I thought about my grandfather, building this place stone by stone, never knowing that 70 years later it would still be standing, still sheltering people who needed it, still teaching lessons about love and loss and the stubborn grace of forgiveness. I thought about Reagan, trying to find her way back to me, one phone call at a time. I thought about Elena, who'd reminded me that homes are meant to be lived in, not mourned. And I thought about myself, 61 years old, still learning how to let go and hold on at the same time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I stood up, brushed off my jeans, and looked at the cabin one last time. "Come on," I said to Elena. "Let's go inside. I'll show you how to make my grandmother's stew." "The one with the carrots?" "The very one." We walked inside together, and I closed the door behind us. The cabin stood silent in the gathering dusk, waiting, as it always had, for the next chapter to begin. "I'm traveling with my friends tomorrow. I sold your mountain cabin. Goodbye." I just calmly replied, "Cabin? I don't have any cabin," and hung up laughing. She had no idea what she had sold,